right, I'd like to call to order the third meeting of the Electric Services Assessment Steering Committee. Happy to have you all with us today. Thank you very much. The audience participation is picking up, and we appreciate the public's interest in our efforts here. Please call the roll, Ms. Finn.
Mr. Smith?
Here.
Mr. Donahue?
Here.
Mr. Turpin?
Here.
Mr. Shanks? Mr. Gilstrap?
Here.
Dr. Miller?
Here.
First order of business is follow-up information and follow-up answers for questions that were posed in our last meeting. Jason Gray is going to do that.
Good afternoon. I'm going to be working off the PowerPoint that you have in front of you. Question came up last month about the congestion charges we were charged in January and the months of February and March. The pie chart you have in front of you lists the resources that we have, Prairie State, Fremont, and the blocks of power, AEP and Morgan Stanley, and the rates that we were charged for those 3 months, the average rate across those periods of time. Prairie State being $24.16, Fremont $10.09. We didn't receive any generation that was in any amount from SEPA, which is 2 hydro facilities in Virginia. AEP was $15.14 a megawatt hour. Morgan Stanley was $21.29. And this is the congestion. Yes, sir.
Jason, is the reason Prairie State and Morgan's is way much higher than the others because they're farther away?
Yes, sir. They pass through the Northern Illinois hub and the AEP Dayton hub.
Follow-up?
Go ahead.
In essence, they're passing through 2 different zones, so we're getting hit twice.
Repeat that?
Yes, my question was, and I think he answered, the reason why Prairie State is so much higher, and it is a whole lot higher, is because we're paying 2 separate congestion charges. That was my question, and I think you affirm that.
Moving on.
Let me ask you one question. This is January through March.
Yes, sir.
We had congestion charges in February and March,
January.
Yes, we did.
but the biggest part of that, and that was 4.8 million.
I actually broke them down on the
Sorry. Where are we at?
separate sheet that you have that's not part of the PowerPoint of each month by resource. This sheet right here.
Yeah, okay, right.
It's the bottom graph.
Great, that's my question, thank you.
I'm sorry, Jason, what sheet was that? This one?
That's it.
Yeah.
Okay. Rock on.
Question. On that sheet, Jason, that second block, the far right column, it says sum. Is that that's an average of it
That's correct.
for that one?
That's correct.
Fremont goes through 2.
No.
I thought, no, Fremont only goes through, is
He was
within.
talking about the Morgan Stanley block that we
Okay.
have in Prairie State.
All right, thank you.
Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm looking at this congestion rate charge, And, you know, we've got to hit this page here. We've got a hit of 50, 60 from Fremont in January, Prairie State at 41, and Morgan Stanley at 37. I don't understand.
The pie chart is an average of those 3 months. What you're looking at is just the month of January.
Right. Then in February and March, we reversed out some.
Right.
Okay. Thank you.
Ms. Shanks.
Is there anything that the city, Danville Utilities can do to avoid Prairie State during high demand periods?
Well, the couple of meetings ago, we mentioned the FTR auctions that PJM has that we've entered to kind of hedge our congestion losses, which we've done for this year, and the swap we did with NextEra. So those are a couple of things that we can do.
And with the swap, where's the energy source that we're swapping Prairie State for?
We're swapping with NextEra from one hub to another.
Pardon me?
We're swapping energy, a certain amount of energy from one hub to another.
Right. So NextEra is within PJM?
Within MISO.
Pardon me?
MISO.
I still didn't hear you.
Within MISO, I guess my mic's not working.
I don't think any of the mics are working.
Midwest RTO, their regional transmission operator. So that we're swapping the transmission and congestion, with the congestion cost for that area to meet it so it's closer to our needs, to our load.
Okay. And Prairie State is where?
Prairie State's in Illinois.
In which? It's in MISO, right? So what I'm not understanding is, if we have Prairie State and MISO, and we're making a swap,
We're swapping into the AEP Dayton hub.
okay, that's what I needed.
Okay.
If the swap is to the AEP Dayton hub, so it's within the PJM interconnect. Okay, thank you.
Okay. The next page on the PowerPoint, Dr. Miller asked last meeting about spinning reserves, what spinning reserves meant. It's basically the compensation that PJM pays to a generator to back down its generation when the market is higher than the generator's cost. They pay, the PJM would pay the generator the lost revenue, and then the load would pay the difference, basically. And there's a definition in here saying that. So it's the difference in the market value and what the generator cost is of producing that power. Moving on, I think Mr. Donner asked last time for a comparison of rates with our neighboring municipalities, and we put together this information. This is from MEPAV, Municipal Electric Providers of Virginia. This is per 1,000 kilowatt hours, and this is broken down by AEP customers, AMP customers, and Dominion customers. And you can see where we fall in a mixture of different communities.
This is a rate for what service
Residential.
class? Residential. Thank you. And this is inclusive of all power cost adjustments for any provider.
PCA, customer charge, everything.
Thank you.
The AMP customers, or the AMP supplied municipals listed here, we're the highest. Is that because they have a different mix of generation sources than we do?
No, a lot of their portfolios are very similar to ours. They're in the same projects we are. I can't speak on every one of them, but I was in a conversation with the Richlands town manager, and they don't have a general fund contribution. So They're
Richlands?
Richlands. So
Okay.
their structure is not the same as ours, but they are a member of the Hydros, and we're signed up for AMPGS, the coal plant that was canceled. So they're in a lot of the projects we are.
Well, I would also conjecture that these operations may have had their power cost adjustment factors in place in the winter when the congestion charges hit. We don't know.
I know Bedford was
They were hit.
tasked with a congestion charge.
Absolutely.
I remember
saw
seeing that in the article this past one. So
And I would think all of these AMP customers were hit with a congestion charge similar to what we were if their portfolios are similar. But maybe they handled it differently.
Can you go back and look at some of their historical data and tell us what the similar prices were last July 13 or some previous period before last winter? Could you? We don't want to think about looking at that. It might reveal to us the timing of these increases that you're talking about, what their rates were compared to ours a year ago.
and you're just talking about the AMP.
Yeah, I'm particularly interested in them because of the similarity of the power source. Their costs are going to be about our costs, or at least we believe that, and we know little about the AEP and Dominion sourced operations.
Okay.
That's what I was trying to get at. So this is as close as we can get to think about where we are, as we kind of break down these costs and analyze them and see why are we where we are today.
Compared to this.
So, July 2013 would be nice to have.
Okay.
Thank you.
Jason, do you have any explanation for Culpeper being competitive with Danville?
I don't have any information why their rates are like they are. No.
Radford's pretty darn close too. I mean, if you backed out the PCA hit that we've just rolled in place, actually we would be in the lower third of this list.
Are all these municipal-owned utilities?
Yes.
Do we have any comparison to those that are not municipally owned?
Like the investor-owned utilities and the cooperatives. I have some of that data. We can bring that back. Any other questions?
No, go ahead.
Thank you.
Next slide is our revenues, expenses, and operational expenses. As you can see that our revenue has been consistent until this year. Our power costs have escalated. We went from 69 million, almost 70 million in 2013 to 92 million this year. Well, 2014. This is fiscal year. The production line to label production is the cost of us running our own hydro plant at the Pinnacles in Keebler Valley. So the Pinnacles plant in Meadows of Dan. So that's the cost of us running our own hydro facility. Operating expenses are very close to each other for every year. Transmission is also substation. Engineering, distribution includes tree trimming activities. Meters, bad debt, customers that we have to write off. General and administrative, this includes a number of salaries, key accounts, director of utilities, customer service, support services. So a number of salaries go into that, as well as our buildings and facilities go into that general and administrative, just to name a few. So that our operation Operational expenses have been fairly flat over the past 5 years. Cost of power, however, has gone up over that same period of time.
Can you explain or describe the $23 million increase in purchase power from 13 to 14? That's a big increase. Do we have some information to kind of describe that big increase to us?
Well, we raised the PCA in February, and then we rolled it into our rates. So that was the difference there.
Would it also include the stranded costs?
That would be the expense.
Excuse me?
That would be expense of, that would be a liability on this.
It is included in the purchase power.
It is.
So the purchase
We
power
had to-
includes the
we had
stranded
to book those
costs, one-time
expenses.
charge stranded costs,
Yes.
one-time charge congestion charges,
Yes,
and the whole PCA was recognized in the 2014 year.
that's correct.
So we took, there's some one-time charges in here
That's right.
that take that number from 69 to 92 million and make it look way out of
So
proportion.
you have
That's
roughly
correct.
11 million in stranded costs and congestion wrapped up.
Right, because in fact, we are going to pay all that back. We just recognized it as being an expense, but we're going to pay it back over a 5-year period for the stranded costs, and I guess we've already paid back the congestion.
We
We've already
have.
paid back.
And we certainly haven't collected the PCA yet, but we will.
Correct.
Okay, I just wanted to, but that's a huge increase. And we need to understand that's not what the number's going to look like next year. I hope not.
No, I
If it
expect
is,
to
we
be
got
back
big
at 70
problems.
million,
Yeah,
70,
okay.
75 million.
All right. Does anybody else have anything?
When you go any further down the chart,
Where do you want to go? What line?
I'd like to go to net income or loss after transfers.
Okay.
Obviously, the line above is the transfers out. The net income after transfers, do each of those numbers roll over to fund balances in each of those respective funds? So each year, other than 2013, about $5 million rolled into net reserve, net
Fund balance.
reserves.
Right.
General fund reserves,
Understood.
reserves in electric
Right.
department. So that would, is that classified, how would you classify that as, in simple terms, as profit? What would you call that?
We have to look at the minimum that we have, and we're getting ready to get into that.
Okay.
You could look at it that way, but we don't necessarily use the word profit.
Right.
We could use it as next year's capital projects.
Yes, but it builds each year unless we expend it.
And we're looking at that in our rate study, if I'm not mistaken, the relative reinvestment that's required to maintain the utility in terms of its ability to serve its customers versus
Cost of service. Yeah.
versus the depreciation that we're experiencing with our plant and equipment.
Right.
Okay.
Any other questions?
So if I'm if I'm interpreting this correctly, in 2013, we operated at a loss,
Of 357,000.
and in 2014, we operated to the good at 5 million, so that's basically a $5.5 million increase from 13.
Would it be a 4.7 increase? We lost 357 in 2013 and gained 5 million in 2014. So we're in
There's
the
actually,
black, 4.7.
I think that's a little misleading, though, wouldn't you say? Because really, our income is before transfers to the general fund or any other special transfers that are requested by council.
Now, we're showing it here after the transfer.
The
Right.
transfers are a line above
Right, but I mean, if I was to compare income to an investor-owned utility, I would look at the net income line before transfers.
Which is 12.2 in 13.
Yeah, I mean, the
But I guess my question, we had a, to the good 12.2 until we transfer 12.5 out.
correct. And then we had nothing to put into the bank to provide for capital improvements for the business in the following year. Matter of fact, we had to utilize some fund balance to help pay for those in the
And
following.
we also decreased the projects.
That's correct. And the reserves.
Joe, is 2013, is that the year we transferred 3 million to
That's correct.
what? Okay.
Anybody else?
I don't see
Mr.
the,
Turpin goes. Mr. Turpin goes.
Well, let him finish and follow up. Go ahead, Joe.
no, I'm going a different direction. Go ahead.
Just a point of clarification, when that big increase in the purchase power from 13 to 14 is shown there, but also the revenue was increased to cover that. So we're still working with the gross profit realistically. That can be confusing sometimes. But we show it in there even though it's still to be collected through the PCA over approximately 2 years.
Right.
John?
I don't see in this sheet here, maybe we'll get to it later, the fund balance, unrestricted fund balance. Do we have that figure?
Ms. Finney, do you have anything for us on that?
In a few slides where Mr. Atkins is going to address, he shows you how it's calculated.
But you don't have that number.
What's the number?
close at hand.
The current number, no, I don't.
We
Could we have the same sheet with that on the bottom line?
yeah, we should have brought that to this meeting.
Yeah, I like that idea if we have each of the years with a fund balance each year.
Michael Atkins, the Director of Finance, will go over the fund balance and how it's calculated. Is there any more questions for me?
Thank you.
I have one more question, and in 13, there was a $986,000 non-operating revenue expense, which is below the net operating line, or the operating income line, 2013. Bracket number $986,000. What was that for? Was it for one thing, or was it for other things?
We'll have to look and see what that is.
Okay, appreciate it.
It's about 5 line items that make up that one line item. It's about 5 line items that we consolidated into
Oh,
one
it
on
is.
this report.
What
It's
would be
not-
an example of one of those items?
I'd have to look into
Okay.
it, but it would be things like interest income and expense, non-operating income, interest income and expense, for example.
Does it include debt service?
No.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chairman, is the reason for the net, explain the difference in the net income in 13 and 14, almost $3 million.
The revenues increased because of the PCA and the rates didn't go into, the new rates didn't go into July. So the PCA increased. That's the reason for 2014 being more revenue and the net income being higher than 2013. In February, we raised the PCA from .016 to .026. Mr. King.
There was questions about the level of general fund transfers that made by other municipalities in Virginia, and that's your place that we revised background report on utility fund transfers to the general fund. And with the help of the Virginia Municipal Electric Power Association, we got information for fiscal 2013, which is the latest they have, verified information, and 11 of their members responded with information, and these are now listed by the highest to the lowest, and you can see the median transfer rate is 6.1, but we are above the median. And then on the back of the sheet, I draw your attention to the last paragraph, and help with the rate consultants to express the transfers and administrative fees, the impact on residential ratepayer. So for every $1 million in transfers or administrative fees, that results in a 0.001 1/10% per kilowatt hour. So the average residential customer, if we were to reduce those transfers of fees by $1 million, would see a $1.16 less in their monthly bill, or $13.92 less in annual fees. And you can do the math to see what impact there would be on any portion of the transfer. And in offsetting that, assuming that the city council chose to increase tax rates to make up for that lost revenue, you can see that every $1 million in lost revenue would require a 4.5% increase in property taxes. So we have checked this figure regularly over the years, and for the Danville property owner, there's a net benefit to having the transfer set up the way they are. So for every dollar you save in utility costs, you pay between 2 and 3 extra in tax rates. Very much simplified, but that gives you a snapshot of the impact of those fees. And more information on how we compare with the other utilities. So I suggest, if you're keeping your notebook up to date, you replace the earlier version with this one.
So, Joe, I mean, just if we were to conjecture, if I may, Mr.
Go ahead,
Chairman,
please.
and we were to eliminate the general fund transfer from the utilities, you're saying we would see an increase in our property tax rate from 73 cents to $1.18.
That's correct.
We would no longer have the fifth lowest property tax rate of Virginia's 39 municipalities. Where would we be? Do you have an idea?
I could easily give you that.
Mr. Shanks?
Thank you.
If that number is going to be provided, could you provide a similar number for the median, if we were the median?
Good idea.
Do you have anything else, Joe? The fund balance policy,
Last time.
Mr. Michael Atkins is the interim finance director for the city of Danville.
I had one more question. I mean, we're talking a magnitude that would be almost we're talking about a 45-cent increase in taxes, which is about a 60% increase in property taxes? Is that correct? 60%. Boy.
And
That would not be-
our sister utilities that are a part of the Virginia municipal, you'll see a pretty direct relationship between tax rates and transfers. Now, This is a very simplistic snapshot of it.
60%.
Right.
Wow. Thank you.
Michael?
I believe last time you met, there was a question about going over a couple of financial policies as they relate to utilities. The first being the fund balance policy. You'll see your slides in your packet there. For utilities in general, the policy for minimum unrestricted fund balance is made up of two components. 90 days of average operating and maintenance expenses, and also 90 days of next year's debt service. The operating and maintenance expenses does not include purchase power. Purchase power is excluded because that's a direct variable cost that's recouped through sales. It also excludes depreciation expense, depreciation expense being a non-cash item. We do include regular capital maintenance and capital improvements to show commitment to the infrastructure. And it also includes transfers to the general fund. Now, an exception is made for the electric fund, and this is done to maintain high credit ratings with AMP Ohio. We use 180 days of operating and maintenance expenses just for the electric fund. So your next slide there shows just an illustrative example using our fiscal 15 electric budget figures. Total budgeted expenses, this is all expenses for electric for fiscal 15, we're just under 150 million. So from that amount, we deduct purchase power, depreciation, and other non-operating items like debt service, contingency, interest expense, the jobbing, and also the energy efficiency program expenditures. So we come down to a total operating expenses for our fiscal 15 budget of just over 52 million. Now, as I said, for AMP Ohio, we do 180 days, which is half a year. So half of that number is a little over 26 million. And then we add that 90 days of next year's debt service to that, and that comes up just a little over 27 million. So for this illustration, that would be our minimum fund, unrestricted fund balance for the electric fund at the end of this fiscal year. Any questions on that?
Stop right there. Questions? Let me ask one question to start. Why is purchase power not included?
I suppose the theory behind that is it's a direct variable cost and it is recouped through sales. So I guess in essence that would take a cost that would take care of itself through sales. The minimum fund balance is to cover things, fixed operating cost and capital.
Fixed budgeted cost.
Right.
Right.
So,
In the 180 days, all the other funds, wastewater, water, and gas only have a 90-day supply of unrestricted fund balance.
Correct.
Electric has 180. Has electric had 180 days before we were buying power or participating in AMP projects?
I believe we were participating with AMP before we had a financial policy for fund balance.
Excuse me?
The fund balance policy came after we began our partnership with AMP Ohio.
So the whole fund balance is not, is it influenced at all by the city's general fund bond ratings? Or is this purely for AMP? Or is it for both?
To my knowledge, the 180 days was an AMP Ohio decision to maintain a good credit rating there. I believe 90 days was the basis for the bond rating agencies for all utility funds.
For the general fund?
The general fund's a little different.
No, I'm talking about because of the city's credit rating, not the utility's credit rating, there had to be some kind of fund balance in the Danville Power and Light. And you're saying that was 90 days until we...
Well, I'm saying we did not have a fund balance policy until after we had started working with AMP Ohio.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions?
well, it'll be interesting to see what our rate study consultants tell us, but when I look at our depreciation rate of $6.6 million, back to Mr. Gilstrap's question earlier, I would be looking for that net income after transfers to be at least $6.65 million to at least maintain our physical plant. If we're running less than that over a long period of time, or even a medium period of time, that would tell me that our physical plant is deteriorating and is not being properly maintained. So that's a little worrisome when I look at these numbers right now.
We'll move on. The other policy was our general fund transfer policy. It is based on the growth of fixed assets. The theory there is it's to reflect the shareholders' return on those fixed assets, the investment in the assets. We do use fiscal 13 as our base year. The way any increase is calculated in the transfer is looking at a 5-year average of the growth in fixed assets, and we round that to the nearest $1,000. The policy also states that the transfer to the general fund will not decrease from the prior year, and any increases will be implemented every other year along with the biennial rate study. So they are constant for 2 years. The fourth slide you have there is an illustrative example of this calculation. The dates across the top, of course, today we have fiscal 14 numbers and we are budgeting for fiscal 16. So there's always a 2-year gap there when we're looking at the actuals and then budgeting for the current year. So we take fixed assets, we back out depreciation, so we're just talking about net fixed assets. For instance, in fiscal 14, the increase in fixed assets after depreciation was $11.6 million, and that was an 8% growth over the prior year. So we averaged that with the previous 4 years, and we come up with a 5-year average of 5.32%. Based on the policy, we use half of that number. So we're looking at increasing the transfer perhaps by 2.6%. And we base that comes to $269,126. Again, we round to the nearest 1,000, so it goes down to an even 269,000. And then that would get added. This is a 2-year period, so it gets added to the fiscal 14 transfer, along with the increase that would have occurred in fiscal 15 if we were increasing every year. So that would show that our maximum contribution for fiscal 16 would be $10,395,610. If it was felt that that was appropriate and necessary, that could be the maximum transfer. Any questions on the transfer policy?
Yes, sir. If in that particular year, the maximum transfer was made, the $10,395,000, then it could never go down?
That's, according to policy, it would never decrease from year to year.
You know, that's probably something either the utility commission or council, preferably the utility commission, will look at again. And that was not considered by the utility commission initially, is that right? Didn't that just go straight from council? So,
Agreed.
noted?
Yep.
Thank you.
Anything else from Mr. Adkins?
One other thing I'd be interested in seeing is our long-term, our debt, because obviously, at least I would expect that our debt has been increasing.
I don't know off the top of my head, but yeah, we could provide a schedule showing debt service for the current year and forward.
If my fixed assets, net of depreciation, have gone up as they have, but I am actually operating income-wise after transfers of less than depreciation, I would expect that our debt is increasing. So it would be helpful to just see that on this line if we could, sir, at the next meeting. Thank you.
Let me follow up that question. There was a $20 million increase in fixed assets from 13-15 to 14-16 columns. That's $20 million. Now, going back to Mr. Donahue's question, which I think supposes that in order to increase these assets, we borrowed money to buy these assets. But we also have assets where we have reserved for money that's been spent on those assets, but those assets have not yet been placed into service. Is that correct?
Yes, there's a reserve for work in process.
So what happens from one year to the next is you may have a large amount, a big project or several projects that would go into service in one year, and then the next year you may not have hardly any.
That's true.
Because they may be over more than one period. So you sort of have to take that into account. Now, the depreciation, the reserve part of reserved for construction in progress, there's no depreciation for that in this, in the retained earnings, in the fund balance.
That's correct. If
Is
it's
that
work in
correct?
process, it has not been,
So we need to look and see what we've spent on assets that we haven't accounted for yet. Is that, do you think that's an important calculation when you're talking about how much money you're spending on these assets? In your opinion?
work in process does show up as fixed assets on the balance sheet. And your question is, should we be looking at how much we've spent?
How much is in process in any particular time so that we can have a better, clearer idea of how much money we're actually spending on reinvesting in our asset base?
Yes, you would need to include that along with things that have been finalized and capitalized, yes.
How often do you all put assets into, account for assets put into service? Once a quarter or once a year?
We monitor it each quarter, but at the end of the year is when we actually make the journal.
But you make decisions every quarter.
Well, at the end of the fiscal year, we consult with utilities to determine which projects have been completed and capitalize them at that point. Until that point, they remain in work in process.
And during that process, if there is interest, we're capitalizing the interest.
Yes.
Okay. Cool.
All right. Thank you. Does anybody else have any questions? Thank you very much, Mr. Atkins.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. King, are you okay? You fine? You got anything to say? Y'all ready? All right.
Could you ask them to see if the sound is up on these mics? I'm having trouble.
I am too. You're working on it? We appreciate that because we've got some old ears over here. Thank you. All right, at this time, I'd like to present John Benatine and Jolene Thompson from American Municipal Power. They are our supplier of power. They are the organization that we work with in procuring our power for the city. They are from Columbus, Ohio, and they are here to talk to us a little bit about the history of their organization and their relationship with us. Okay. And then I hope we're going to talk about some of the challenges that we've had in the last few years and some of those solutions to those challenges. Ms. Thompson, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the steering committee. I am Jolene Thompson with AMP. This is John Benatine. We have both been with the organization for a number of years. John, a few more years than I have. I've been there about 25 years. And John's been with the organization both as our outside counsel and then as our internal general counsel for 33 years now. So we've been around since the organization was in one state and have watched it grow to serve members in 7 states, and we're very proud of what we've accomplished. We don't have the PowerPoint up, do we? But you've got it in front of you. So you should have in front of you a copy of our PowerPoint presentation. You also should have this folder. This is a folder that has information on all of our different projects and our services that goes into much more detail than we have time this evening to go into, but I would call your attention to that as some follow-up reading if you'd like some more information. So tonight, as the chairman indicated, we've been asked to talk a bit about the history of the organization, as well as the polar vortex, your power supply, and then when we came in, the chairman asked if we would make a few comments about the EPA rules for carbon control at existing power plants, and I'm happy to do that. So I'm on page 4 of the slide presentation. This is an overview of AMP today, and there's more on this in the services folder that we left with you. We do serve 129 members. You can see the list of states that we have members in. It's Ohio and Pennsylvania, Michigan, Virginia, West Virginia, and Kentucky. And we also serve the Delaware Municipal Electric Corporation located in Delaware. They are a smaller joint action agency similar to AMP. They have 9 member communities in Delaware. We have about 170 employees at our headquarters and our generating facilities, and you can see some statistics there on our peak and our sales and our revenue and our assets. The assets are what we're here to talk to you about tonight. In large part, these are the generating assets that you see listed there, the $5.6 billion in assets. And a bit of discussion earlier about the credit ratings. We have been very proud to keep our credit ratings in the very high category, which allows us to have lower cost financing. So on slide 5, a bit more about AMP. We are a projects-based organization. There are entities like AMP across the country, known as joint action agencies, that serve multiple municipal electric systems. Most of them are called full requirements providers, so all of their members are in all of their projects. That's not how AMP was formed and founded. That's not how we operate today. We are a projects-based organization. Our members are very diverse. They're very different. They have different wants and needs with respect to their power supply, and so we think it's very important that they have the opportunity to make those choices locally. And so rather than all of our members being in all of our projects, those choices rest with our local communities. Each member's governing board, so city councils, borough councils, depending on which state you're operating in, take into account information about projects and then vote locally on the amount that they would like to participate in a project. One thing that we have recommended is portfolio diversity, which goes into our discussion a little bit about what's happening with the EPA rules and how well our members who are in our projects are positioned for those, quite frankly. Our belief has always been that it's not a good idea to place your eggs all in one basket. It's a good idea to have slices of different types of power supply in your portfolio, which you do, and that's the mantra that our members typically operate under. Our members do benefit from the scale and the economies of scale provided by having an organization like AMP. We can go out and negotiate deals on behalf of a larger group of our members that when our members were operating on their own, they couldn't always get. One thing to note about our members, they're all transmission dependent. So like Danville, our members do not own transmission system facilities. We have to arrange for that transmission through the regional transmission organizations. In the old days, we used to arrange for that transmission directly with the transmission owners. The majority of our members operate in the PJM interconnection, which is where Danville operates, obviously. Used to have about half our membership in MISO, which is further to the west, and about half our membership in PJM. And then in 2011, 2 of the private utilities that had been in MISO decided to move to the PJM interconnection because they saw the opportunity for greater profits in the capacity markets in PJM than they did in MISO. MISO has a voluntary capacity market. PJM has a mandatory capacity market, and John Benteen will talk more about that during his remarks. So about 5% of our members now operate in MISO and 95% in PJM. And those markets are very complicated, as I'm sure you know from your discussions about what's happening with pricing, and capacity, and energy. On page 6, I have a list of the services we provide. Obviously, you're familiar with the power supply services. We also do offer a variety of other services. Danville is a participant in our mutual aid program. So if there's an emergency, you have system outage issues that's caused by a natural disaster, we can have other members assist you in restoration of power. You've also benefited from the fact that we have paid for the APPA, the American Public Power Association dues for all of our members. That's something we thought was so important that we decided to pick up the cost of those dues for all of our members. I think that's about $34,000 that Danville was paying in APPA dues that now AMP is covering as part of our negotiation with APPA to cover dues for all of our members. We also had a scholarship finalist from Danville this year, and we've helped you out with some things that you've worked on, like your RP3 designation, which you should be very proud of. We've helped you with the preparation of those applications. So you can see a list of services there. Some of our services are subscription. Most of them are covered by service fees. And there's a full breakdown in your services folder that shows you what service fee A and B are and what's covered by each of those. I would note one of the items on that sheet notes regulatory compliance assistance. That includes things like working with PJM, FERC, the EPA, negotiating and being involved in industry stakeholder groups. So on the next slide, we talk about our governance today. As the organization has grown, our board has grown. We now have 20 board members. Danville holds the seat for the Virginia Service Group. which we're very pleased to have Danville involved. The board is very active, as Jason can tell you, and as Joe can tell you from his time on the board. We meet about a day and a half each month. A very hands-on board. So while staff make recommendations, it really is truly a board-driven organization. Project governance, as I mentioned earlier, each member makes the decision on which projects you'd like to participate in, and then each of those projects has a participants group that governs it. And so the Prairie State project, the Fremont project that you're involved in, the hydro projects, have their own separate governing group made up of participants who have regular meetings and receive reports and make decisions, all the big decisions with respect to things like fuel purchasing, finances, those sorts of things. So while the AMP board is involved as well, there is a participants group for each project governing that. We then have a series of slides, which I will not spend a ton of time on, talking about the history of the organization. Suffice it to say, the organization started in Ohio, hence the original name was AMP Ohio. We did drop the Ohio out of the name. You'll see that in the timeline. In fact, Joe was on the board when we did that, and I think participated in the focus group process when we were going through that discussion. But back in the 60s, a group of city officials from our communities in Ohio realized that they were working on their own. They really had no network to work with. And they decided to try to create some sort of affiliation, an organization of some kind. And they started a trade association in the 60s. And by the time we got to the 70s, it was clear that that group needed to become more technical and more focused on power supply. If you looked at the average municipal electric system in Ohio at the point we were formed, they were really islands. They either operated their own local generation or they were fully beholden to an investor-owned utility as their power supplier. They didn't have second interconnections to the transmission grid, which meant if something went down with their one interconnection, they were out of power, out of supply, unless they had local generation. And they felt that they were captive customers of their suppliers, and they really wanted to take more control over their own destiny. And so you'll see a series of things listed here where AMP was formed as an organization to help them do just that. Take more control of their destiny, negotiate to get wholesale power, look at regulatory proceedings. For instance, we list here when AEP moved their headquarters into Ohio when they took over Columbus and Southern Electric. We were able to negotiate in that merger conditions to allow us to have access to power and to transmission. And you see that as you go through this list of nuclear licensing conditions and a variety of other instances where we were able to negotiate to get power supply and get transmission access for our members, which gave them the opportunity to have more control over their destiny. So you'll see as you go through this, we continue to grow. If you go to page 10, we talk about the fact that this is our first generating asset we acquired in 1987. We bought into a coal facility that had been associated with a chemical steel processing facility in southern Ohio. That was our first owned generation for us, and that was a big deal. Our members actually had generation that they owned for the first time. That plant was later retired in 2010, but it was a great workhorse for us for many years. If you go to the next page, you'll see that we are fighting for second delivery points for our communities to try to improve their grid reliability so that they didn't just have one interconnection to the transmission grid. And if something happened to that interconnection, they could be without power, and that was not good for their customers, their businesses. And so we were able to fight to get second delivery points for Ohio members. You'll see then we start layering in some of the federal activities that happened. In 1992, the Federal Energy Policy Act was passed by Congress calling for additional competition in the wholesale power field. Some of the competition that we had negotiated as part of regulatory settlements before, now others were starting to get in the market as well, but we had a lot more experience than they did because we've been doing it for a number of years. So you'll go through and you'll continue to see additional rules at the federal level. As the federal side of things got more complicated, we had outside Ohio cities and villages that operated their own electric systems approach us and say, can you help us? This is getting very complicated. Our staff doesn't have the time, the ability to get maybe up to speed on everything happening federally, and so we picked up our first out-of-state members, if we want to call them that. We now don't look at it that way. It's a 7-state organization, but that was New Martinsville and Philippi, West Virginia were our first non-Ohio members. In 1998 and 1999, the wholesale market was extremely volatile. It was, at that time, this is before regional transmission organizations, and we saw utilities that owned both transmission and generation, quite frankly, in our opinion, gaming the system to benefit their generation, and it made our members very frustrated and led to the desire to have a strategic planning process and talk about what we could do to further reduce our exposure to the market, because the market was getting more volatile. And so the board conducted a strategic planning process and came up with the decision that it was important for us to own some generation. In addition to the coal plant that we had in Marietta, Ohio, which was a 213 megawatt plant, the decision was made to get more generation, diverse generation. We had a good experience with a hydro project that we had done, a 42 megawatt hydro project. And so we started looking at what types of generation might make sense to layer into our portfolio. And so over the next few years, we worked at looking at that, looking at hydro, looking at coal, looking at gas. You'll see that Danville joined us in 2006. You'll see that we announced in 2005 the site for the AMP-GS project. That's the canceled coal plant project in Southern Ohio, which John will talk more about. And then you'll see in 2006, PJM starts the process of going towards the launch in 2007 of their capacity market, which stood everything, quite frankly, on end. Now you had to buy capacity in the capacity market. You didn't have that choice of having it on your own. You had to buy it in the capacity market. So it forced our members into this market. So back in 2009, I mentioned earlier, we changed our name. We dropped the Ohio in recognition of the fact that we had members in, at that time, 5 other states, and we thought it was important to be representative of that. The hydro projects, the first one that we started construction on in 2009 that you're involved in, and that is nearing completion. We have that staffed, and we're starting the commissioning process. You'll see there's some indications of what was happening with cap and trade, the carbon dioxide cap and trade legislation in Congress. I should note that there's no correlation whatsoever to the cancellation of the AMP-GS project and the notes of what's happening with CO2. The AMP-GS project, as you know, was canceled due to an unexpected increase from the contractor, not because of environmental regulations. We were confident we had passed our permitting process, we had all the permits in hand, and felt very comfortable with where we were on that side of things. So you'll see at the end of that, on page 14, the US EPA starts to win some court cases. It starts to give them some groundwork in which they could launch regulation of CO2, not through legislation, but through regulatory action, which is what we're dealing with today. On page 15, you'll see the fact that the Fremont Energy Project and the Prairie State Project came online, and the Napoleon Solar Project, which was our first big solar project, came online as well.
Mr. Chairman, can I ask a question?
Please.
Recently, I had an opportunity to review a letter that you had suggested that we author regarding the proposed EPA regulations.
Yes.
And I found it odd that there was no request in there to postpone the increase in CO2 regulation from the current timing that's proposed in that ruling. Could you explain why?
Well, it's a good question. Our comments will indicate that the timeline is too tight. We abbreviated what we put into the letter for members to send in. That's a good point, certainly something. Our comments are going to be 40 pages long, and we tried to boil that down to a couple of pages and hit on the main points. We know that a lot of people are asking for the timeline to be delayed. Our biggest focus, quite frankly, has been making sure that you get credit for your hydro. The way the rule is currently written, and I can get into this in a minute, the new hydro may fall through the cracks, and to the extent that there's a possibility of getting credit for it, hydro coming online between 2012 and 2017 may fall through the cracks. That's a very unique position that we have, our members in those projects have, and so we've been very focused on that in our discussions with US EPA. We agree, the timeline is ridiculous on this rule, quite frankly. There's just not enough time to prepare for it. It will be in our comments, it will be in APPA's comments, it will be in Prairie State's comments, a number of other folks as well. It's a very good question.
And have we estimated at this time what the impact would be on the Prairie State asset and our other coal generation asset if the CO2 regulation is not postponed?
Well,
and achieves the project, at least I see EPA is backing off a little bit on this, but if it was to turn tail, which it might do in this administration, and decide to proceed along the original timeline, what's the impact on the asset?
Well, it's a difficult question to answer because each state has to write a plan. Can I back up a little bit and talk about the 111D rule? I think most of you are probably aware that the Obama administration has chosen to regulate greenhouse gases from new and existing power plants using the Clean Air Act. which was not a piece of legislation ever designed or contemplated to regulate CO2. It was designed to regulate things like SO2 and NOx, and certainly not CO2.
Right.
And there are a variety of really good legal arguments why this is not the right place to do it, but this is how they're proceeding. So they've gone...
It's a bit absurd, but besides that, you know, I mean, it is, CO2 is a natural byproduct of a combustion process, the last I knew.
Well, and it's also very difficult because you can't really regulate it coming out of a smokestack. It's a, right. So they've decided to regulate existing coal plants under something called 111D, Section 111D of the Clean Air Act. New plants will be regulated under Section 111B, and we filed comments on all of these. They're all on our website. I'm happy to put them together and email them to you as well, or get them to Jason to pass along. On the 111D section, they have decided to regulate existing coal and gas plants under that standard. That standard requires the US EPA to set standards, and then the states have to write a plan to enforce them, something called a state implementation plan. So the rule was proposed this year. Its comment time frame is the beginning of December. We all asked for an extension, and the EPA gave us an extension until right after Thanksgiving, which we thought was a nice gift-wrapped, hand, so we could work during Thanksgiving. And then the rule's designed to be finalized by June of next year. Then states have until June of 2016 to submit their implementation plans, so just 1 year to write an implementation plan, because they're not going to see the final rule till June of next year. If they decide to work as a multi-state compact, they can get an additional extension of a year until June of 2017. So the rule has four actually building blocks to it. The first is requiring a 6% efficiency improvement at existing coal plants. I would suffice to say if an existing coal plant owner could get a 6% efficiency improvement, they would have already done it. So that number is very aggressive. The second building block is designed to require 70% utilization rate of natural gas plants. They did back down a little bit on that in some additional data they just released. And the third and fourth building blocks involve assumptions the EPA has made about how much can be invested in renewable energy efficiency. So the EPA took all those assumptions, used the assumptions for what each state could accomplish using those four building blocks, and then set a standard for each state. So every state has a different target to meet based on what the US EPA thinks they can do under those four building blocks. And the states can choose to use those building blocks or not use those building blocks in writing their plan. The good news for us is that Prairie State is a very new, very efficient project. If you look at its emissions rate compared to what the average coal rate is in Illinois, it is the most attractive. So you're in very good position in Illinois. The folks at Prairie State have been working very hard with the state EPA officials in Illinois to talk to them. Until they start writing their plan, after they see a final rule, we won't know for sure. But again, positioned in a very strong way there because it's a new plant. The Fremont gas plant is the same way in Ohio because it's natural gas. It's positioned in a very strong position as well. And we've been talking to the Ohio EPA on a very regular basis about that facility. And then you have the opportunities. So those are the obligations, the coal plant and the gas plant. The opportunities, to the extent this survives the multitude of legal challenges that are already being brought and will continue to be brought, are value for things like energy efficiency that you're doing, or the hydro investments that you've made, or other renewables. And so we're trying to make sure we're being pragmatic about it and assuming, let's just say this thing stands and doesn't get thrown out in court. What can we do to ensure that the US EPA recognizes new hydro, particularly because the amount of investment our members have made? We've had some good discussions with them about this. It's very unclear in the rule what happens to brand new projects. There's a period of time between 2012 and 2017 that's very murky.
But
so we've been negotiating.
Can I go back to, if it's a state rule, and we're looking at state generating assets within a state, I may be mistaken, but our hydro assets are not in the state of Illinois.
They are not in the state of Illinois.
So how would they contribute to our ability to be able to minimize the impact on Prairie State?
You would get some kind of compliance obligation perhaps in Illinois. You're going to get some kind of benefit from the hydro facilities, depending on whether they grant them
if it's a state rule,
you'll get a benefit
based upon generating assets within a state. I don't understand how those hydro plants are going to benefit us at all in Illinois.
They won't benefit you in Illinois, but they'll benefit you potentially in Kentucky, or in Ohio, or in Virginia, depending on where they're located.
But we don't have assets that are going to benefit from that in those states. So to me, I'm just thinking about Danville, okay? I don't see where that's going to benefit us at all. I mean, to me, the biggest benefit we can have is to delay this absurd law. So perhaps the hydro is going to impact your members in Ohio, but it's not going to impact your members here in Virginia that aren't going to see that benefit.
Any benefit that accrues to that project in whatever state it's located or however it's counted would accrue back to all the participants.
And again,
Actually.
but again, if we're talking state boundaries, again, forgive me if I'm not catching this, but Illinois and Ohio are different states. And unless they're going to band together as a region, and I doubt they're going to do that, those hydropower plants do nothing for that asset in Illinois.
They do something for the folks that have a compliance obligation. Let's say it's going into Ohio. There are utilities, not us, well, except for
Okay, but
Fremont.
again, it's not benefiting Danville.
But it will, because if there's an intrastate trading market or some kind of intrastate program, which is very likely in the states we've talked to, there'll be some value. So the folks that own coal in Ohio that need to offset their coal in Ohio see our hydro coming into Ohio. There's a value to accrue to that. And so what we're trying to do is make sure to the extent there's a
That's
value-
Ohio. I'm in Virginia. I'm in Danville, Virginia.
Which would contractually go back to all of our participants. It would not just go, it would contractually flow.
Only
back to
if
the
I'm
contract.
participating in those units.
If you're in the hydro projects and there's a benefit to the hydro projects, it will go back out to all the participants in the hydro projects.
Okay.
I don't disagree with you that the rule itself is absurd in its construction, but we're looking at the fact that there are some opportunities here. We know that at least 2 of our states are very interested in trying to cut it for the hydro. To the extent they do that and we get a value for that, then we'll go back through the contract and that would prorate back out to the participants.
So what you're saying is these risks, these liabilities and these assets, these various plants, the characteristics of them, whatever the 4 building blocks are, they're aggregated. They start at the plant level, go up to the state level. Then the state has to sort that out with the EPA.
Yes.
So in every state that we are participating, we have some stake in that state's aggregated
That is correct.
liabilities and assets.
That is correct.
Is
And
that so it is an indirect use?
Correct. And we have been involved in the stakeholder process in Ohio, Kentucky, and West Virginia, where we have assets, as well as working through Prairie State and Illinois.
Okay.
So we're working very closely with the EPAs in those states as they set their plans, when they start that process, to try to ensure, to the extent there's a benefit to be had, you get that, and it will accrue out.
Okay, so after we go through this grading process and the states implement and the federal government sets up their scoring system, what are the penalties for
Well,
the generators?
it depends on what the state sets up as their plan, and so it's very difficult
What
to
are some
answer.
of the kinds of, are they going to have a tax per kilowatt hour?
They
or
could. A state could decide, some states are going to work together. If you've heard of the RGGI states, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, the states in the northeastern part of the country have a trading program. So there are some states in PJM already doing that. We're not advocating for that, but there are some states doing that. The MISO states are talking about creating a MISO-wide trading program of some sort, just talking about it. The PJM states, not in RGGI, are typically talking about doing their own thing at this point, but depending on how they see this play out, could decide to be part of a multi-state effort. But you're right, a state could do a cap and trade program, they could do a tax, they could try to control it all through coal plant shutdowns and switching to natural gas. They could try to do it by adding more renewables or more energy efficiency. And that's what the complication is every state can do something different.
All right, which brings me to the next question. Good lead in. Is the coal plant that we have, Prairie States,
Yes.
is that comparable with a natural gas plant today on cost?
On cost?
On cost, on price, on the price per kilowatt hour produced?
No, but I'll let John answer that.
If you're talking about the variable cost of the generation itself, the coal plant is much cheaper. The Illinois coal, we own the reserves, it's mine mouth, it comes straight in, and so it's going out of there 17, 18 to $20.
So you're not including the amortization, the
That's right.
depreciation of the construction cost?
That's right, you're not including debt on that. So variable cost, clearly, the coal plant is cheaper than Fremont. Fremont is probably in the 30-cent range, 35-cent range.
Okay. All right, and next question, and it's same comparison.
$35 per megawatt hour. Sorry.
Between coal and gas, is the coal plant that much bigger a polluter than a gas plant? Because it's new and it has the technology.
It's about double the CO2 footprint typically.
Double?
Double, and states can choose to regulate by either a rate-based calculation or a mass-based calculation.
What was the second one? I'm
The
sorry.
states can make a choice about whether they want to regulate their CO2 emitting facilities by either a rate-based calculation, so a number per megawatt hour, or a mass-based program which says we're going to cap the emissions in our state of CO2 at this amount, and we're going to deal with it that way. We don't have any way of knowing until the states start filing plans which states will go mass-based and which states will go rate-based. But because Prairie State is so efficient, because it is new, it is the best of the class on the coal front.
And how much more efficient is it than the average coal plant in Illinois?
I don't want to give you incorrect numbers. I have those
The
numbers.
range would be fine, understanding.
No, heavens, do you know off the top of your head? I would really like to follow up that answer if I could.
Another presentation, and we can get you.
Yes, we can get you
Please.
that.
And then the other question I would have is, because this is a state policy, but they do have a efficiency bogey
Yes.
on a physical plant asset, even though this is a new asset, would we potentially be looking at investment to boost the efficiency of this asset?
It would be very difficult to boost the efficiency because it is a new facility, and so it's not likely that they're going to say that. It's that.
I understand that, but potentially, we could be asked, I mean, regulation is not meant to be logical
Right.
or rational, but potentially, we could be asked to increase the efficiency of a very high efficiency unit, which may be very difficult to do.
Potentially, that's not the direction we've heard from the Illinois EPA at this point, but potentially, until it's all solved, we
Until it's
don't
all
know.
solved, it's a risk.
And just so you know, if the state plans don't meet with the federal EPA's approval, then the federal EPA can send down their own plan.
Correct.
No state really wants that to happen.
But they have that as a trump card.
They have that as a trump card. That's absolutely right.
Which means they have leverage in the negotiations and they're going to get what they want.
They certainly have
In the
leverage,
end.
yes. And again, I foresee years of legal challenges to this, quite frankly. It is a very precedent-setting structure of this rule, and it's already being challenged by a number of large entities, and that will continue throughout the process. So having some of the answers you're asking for may be a number of years away just because of the court challenges.
Which way are states going? Are they going to band together and have their own implementation plans, or are they just state by state? What's the trend right now?
Right now, everyone is holding their cards really close to the vest for the most part. No one wants to show those. You're going to see when the comments are filed December 1st. What you're seeing is some states that are filing comments saying, heck no, we're not going to go at all. We don't want to deal with this. Other states are trying to file questions saying, here's what we don't understand about your rule, or here's what doesn't make sense. So there's a mix. And then there's some states that are embracing it. Not many, but a few. You can guess where those might be located. Right now, we have no reason to think that the PJM states are working on any kind of trading program across the states. Doesn't mean they might not change their mind in a couple of years. We don't see it yet. MISO has been much more vocal about that than PJM has been, the states in MISO.
And are there any rights, so to speak, being given to states downstream of large generators in this legislation?
If they were there, they would be done inherently through what they said is their assumptions for the state. So I don't know that I can say I've seen anything explicitly on that.
Okay, thank you.
Fred, did you have something?
Yes, since the regulatory environment changed in 2009 with new regulations and some of these proposed regulations, has AMP Ohio experienced early retirement of coal facilities? And if so, have we been partners in any of those facilities?
We have experienced the retirement of that Gorsuch plant that I mentioned came online back in the 80s. That was...
Was that planned retirement?
It was... I have to see how I answered that. It was negotiated retirement with the U.S. EPA. The plant came online when Harry Truman was president, so it had served its useful life, and no, Danville was not involved in that project.
Okay.
Please continue.
So that really took me to where I was going, and that is we're really busy right now trying to track down all these EPA regulations. I would encourage you, if you're interested in sending a letter, please, if you want to put more strident comments in it, that would be fine. We tried to put something out that we thought would be a broad-based stroke across our membership. So if you have something you feel strongly about, certainly include something stronger in it. That's not anything that we would be concerned about. And then, as you know, in addition to all these EPA regulations, you have all the things going on with the RTOs, and that's a lot of what John is going to talk about. So that's my part. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Thompson.
Thank you.
Thanks, it's good to be here. Long flight and, or at least setting on the airport today.
Sorry about that.
No.
I hope I'm not doing that tomorrow.
Actually, it was Columbus's fault. They were running out of de-icing, even though the snowstorm had been predicted. I want to add a couple of things really quick. On Mr. Donohue's questions on how do you get the value from here to here, we have had a number of conversations with states, with the US EPA on exactly that issue, and because what could happen is, okay, Ohio's got a bunch of load, Virginia's got some load that is served by the hydros. Well, what happens if Kentucky tries to take credit for all of it?
Right.
And Ohio says, no, we want some of it, the load's here, that's where it's served, that's who's paying for it. It sets up an issue when both those plans then go to the US EPA. So there has been discussion of a follow the load kind of thing for hydros or other renewables that have benefits that are being paid for by people in different states. It's even a larger problem for some of the wind stuff out in the far Midwest. Which doesn't serve hardly any load because there's not a lot of load in those states.
Yeah, I mean, I can clearly understand the logic that you're applying, which is follow the ownership of, the ultimate ownership of the facility, not where it's physically located. And I can see where perhaps you can make some headway on renewables and solar, probably not in the other area.
Other stuff is hard.
Yes. Thank you.
I want to talk a little bit about one other thing before I go into the next slide here, and that is the questions on the congestion charges that you talked about earlier. And Jolene mentioned it, but I want to make sure everybody understands. Prairie State, when Prairie State was planned and everybody signed up for it, 50% of AMP's membership load was in PJM and 50% was in MISO. And the way the contract was structured, it was to be delivered to the PJM MISO border, and then the costs would be split. So it didn't matter that it was in MISO. The PJM folks were going to be paying the same thing as the MISO folks, okay? And then what happened, as Jolene indicated, was First Energy and Duke went to the FERC, got it changed. So AMP then had the asset of Prairie State in MISO left, and now we had 95% of our load in PJM. So that meant that our congestion that we were looking at, that pancake that you were talking about, really sort of doubled because that gets split among all of the AMP members. So that's just some background I wanted to make sure that...
Follow up on that, please.
Sure.
So you're saying that 95% of AMP members are actually paying double congestion charges like Danville?
Well, let me say it this way. Before, we were going to be paying for 50% of the load staying in PJM and 50% of the load going to, 50% staying in MISO and 50% going into PJM. And that 100% then was going to be split among all of the AMP members in the project, okay? Now, because of what First Energy and Duke were allowed by the FERC to do, we now have 95% of that is going MISO to PJM and only 5% staying in MISO, okay? So in that situation then, we have really about 45% more of that congestion cost going from to all the way into PJM. So it was a lot more for everybody, not just you or not just the people that were actually in MISO. And some of the things that Jason talked to you about earlier, where you have swaps, some of the load will stay and serve load in MISO, and then you'll buy out of PJM, and that's how those things happen.
Well, let me just make sure I understand. 95% of your members are in PJM.
Correct.
Okay.
Today.
So in theory, all the congestion charges that ended up being charged were equally charged or proportionally charged to all of those members.
Is proportionally charged to all 100% of our members that are in this project.
Which is about 50?
Yeah, it's about 50-50.
Well, and just while I have the opportunity, right now, this is creating, I know it's creating a problem for you, but for Danville, it's creating a real problem.
But there are other reasons that you're getting congestion down here other than just that one.
I'm anxious to hear.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, okay.
Quick, follow.
Oh, yes, sir.
You said Duke and East Energy, I guess, went to FERC and they got it to change.
That's
Was
correct.
that a rate case?
No, it
Did
wasn't.
we have an opportunity to have any comments or input on that?
Yes, we had an opportunity to have comments. We made comments. We opposed those changes absent something that would protect us. And frankly, we were given the short shrift by the FERC. But no, we opposed both of those. We intervened in those mergers and, excuse me, those changes of RTO in both of those, and said they shouldn't be approved unless load interest were held harmless in those. And that really fell on deaf ears. So we tried.
Go ahead.
I'm on slide 17, just, and I'll go through these quickly. This is just showing that Danville Energy used in 11, 12, and 13, what you're forecasted to use now in 14 and forecasted to use in 15. You had pretty flat load growth over the years, the recent years. The next chart shows what your monthly energy totals were by year. And you'll see the red line there, 2014 polar vortex, how much energy you end up using in that in January of 2014. So you not only had the additional congestion and those uplift charges that I'll talk about in a bit, but you were using a lot because it was really cold. So it's sort of the double whammy there. You know, in the energy market, and by the way, let me compliment you folks. Jolene and I go out all the time. This is obviously a steering committee that has done its homework and is pretty conversant in a lot of these very difficult things. And I'm not just blowing smoke there. Some places we go are a lot less sophisticated than this group is. So I compliment you on what you're doing. But as you know, there's capacity that you need to get, and as Jolene said, you got to buy that capacity. In fact, you have to buy 115% of what your peak load is going to be. This shows what your peaks have been. Again, the polar vortex, your peak demand was on January 30th, 229 megawatts, which just about equaled your highest summer peak ever. The next chart on 20 is just another graph that shows a couple things. One is that peaks are usually somewhat temperature related. And in 2014, there is a mistake on this graph. That is the summer high out here during the summer peak of 92 that shows down there under that red line. But that was at the 229 was actually on January 30th. But you'll see that your load is not increasing as GDP is, which I'm not, I don't think is a surprise to anyone down here, but it is a temperature-sensitive load, and for the first time in the polar vortex, you really had a winter peak.
I understand that many utilities are also not seeing growth equivalent to GDP. My friends at AEP say they've got the same problems.
It really is, and it's two things. One is, regardless of what people say, I think the economy is still not as robust as it was prior to the recession, and we are seeing, even with all the things that are plugged in now, and charging your cell phones and all of that, we are seeing some energy efficiency decreases. We're seeing some demand response things, and so we're not using as much really as we used to. And I think that's really even more apparent on the industrial side right now, both because it hasn't recovered completely and because they have put dollars into variable speed drives, et cetera, that are using a lot less electricity. I won't bore you with that because you guys know all this. This is just, you're paying energy charges and you pay demand charges, and then the average then comes out to what you pay per kWh, and that's, I know that's not lost on you folks. As Jolene said, PJM's RTO, not going to spend any time on this, they do operate the grid, and by operate, they tell the owners of the transmission system what to do. They also tell the operators of generation what to do. So yeah, yes, sir.
Can we ask a question?
Sure, you can, yes, jump in anytime.
Who owns PJM? We had this question at our last meeting, and we're a bunch of bumpkins on this.
I might be the wrong person to ask, because Jolene laughs because I'm always on a soapbox about PJM. PJM is run by its staff. It has a, quote, independent board of directors.
Okay.
It has no stakeholder representatives on its board by design. It is not transparent. Their board meetings are closed to stakeholders. They're closed to the public. We don't like the way that PJM is run. We don't like the lack of transparency there. Some of the RTOs are different. PJM has been very aggressive in creation of these markets. Originally, RTOs were put out there to be the traffic cop of transmission, right, so the people that own generation couldn't use transmission to help themselves. Frankly, right now, hardly anybody is happy with PJM. And they have some proposals now, which I won't go into, but they have some proposals now on performance capacity, which I think, and a lot of other people think, we think could really increase the cost of capacity in all of PJM, which affects all load interests. So they're a nonprofit corporation, so they're not owned. They are what I would say is very lightly regulated by the FERC. I think the FERC takes the position that because the RTOs are independent of the generators, independent of the transmission owners, independent of the load interests, that they almost get a rebuttable presumption, if I can use those words, that what they propose is reasonable. And there are a lot of committees that things go through, but it's not a functional organization, in my personal view.
Where do the members come from? I mean, it says Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Maryland, but there's...
It started out as Pennsylvania, Jersey, and Maryland. It expanded west 2006, 5, and started going south, coming into Virginia. And the expansion was due to additional transmission systems joining. Ohio, for example, said you have to join some RTO and we are going to encourage that, the Public Utilities Commission, but you can pick anyone you want. And so we had the switch, yeah, where First Energy went in, where Duke took their Ohio and Kentucky operations in. So when AEP went into PJM, that's how you folks got in it down here. But it expanded west into Pennsylvania. Even Commonwealth Edison up in Chicago is now part of PJM, even though it's sort of surrounded by MISO.
Right.
So it's the transmission owner gets to choose. And so it started expanding, and as Jolene indicated, some of the movement is because prices looked like they were going to be better for generators in the PJM market, and that's why First Energy and Duke, we believe, moved.
And who appoints the members?
I'm sorry?
Who appoints the members?
The board of directors.
The board is appointed basically by the board.
By the board.
There can be other nominations that are made.
They're an independent authority.
They're an independent authority.
Did you say the board was selected by the board?
Well, certainly the board nominees are selected by the board. They can't have worked for anybody that is in PJM for a year or two. I can provide you that. We're going through that.
That's a good idea.
Yeah.
That would be interesting to know. It's a self-selecting board, and they all have had ties with the industry in one way or another.
They're supposed to have had experience in some way or another, but they can't have had any recent ties to any member of PJM, which could be a generator, a transmission owner, could be a load interest, AMP.
Sure.
We're a member of PJM as a load-serving entity, and so we get one vote in that sector. We have two people at AMP, and I'm not exaggerating, we have two people at AMP, an engineer, Chris Norton, and an attorney that works with me, Lisa McAllister, that probably spend 25 hours a week on various PJM conference calls. There is something going on all the time to change things, which ain't no way to run a railroad that is investing billions of dollars in 50-year assets to have things change all the time.
Maybe this is a good time to ask this question. I know the electric industry is very complicated, as has been pointed out, but of the various entities that we have to go through to get power to Danville, as I understand it, we got the generation, we got the PJM, regional transmission, we've got AMP, we've got American Electric Power, etc. How are the rates that they charge Danville established with all those different entities? Are they by contract? Are they regulated? Especially PJM.
Well, that goes back to my point. I don't think PJM is regulated by the FERC. I think the FERC gives them a pass on just about whatever they want to do. But some of those rates are regulated, in effect, by PJM because they're in their tariff.
They're not accountable to FERC, or they're
I would say they're very lightly accountable to FERC, but technically their tariffs need to be approved by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. Some of what you buy is contractual. With AMP, you have contracts with AMP. And it's a little bit, in some ways, like having contracts with yourself. You sit on AMP's board, you are an owner, in effect, even though AMP is nonprofit. The transmission charges themselves are regulated by FERC. So right now, First Energy has just filed a transmission increase of some substance, and AMP is intervening in that on behalf of its members that will be
American Electric Power's control rates.
Right. So AEP is the same way. AEP controls its actual transmission charge. That's in a FERC tariff. All these other ancillary charges, however, are done by PJM tariffs. So spinning reserves and all of those wild things
But it seems sort of unfair that PJM can charge what they want, but FERC doesn't have a rate case or a hearing for people to have input?
PJM files tariffs, which includes the rates for the things that they do. Those tariffs then are noticed by the FERC. People can intervene in that if they care to. We have opposed some of the filings by PJM, not successful very often, but there is an opportunity. There is a legal opportunity for you to oppose those things.
For all of these areas where it's regulated, then AMP represents Danville in these situations for our interest?
That's correct. So we have DC attorneys, we have experts, that when a rate case is filed, when PJM does something that we think is adverse to our interest, we participate in the stakeholder process. Those people that sit on those 25 hours of telephone calls or go to the meetings that are called, that's part of what you pay for with them.
Would you consider, is a playing field level for people like Danville to get our power here?
I think right now, I think the PJM so-called quote market unquote is dysfunctional. I don't think it provides protections of a market. I think it, right now it's slanted toward
Opportunistic.
They want to make a market out of everything, and it doesn't seem to be working for anybody right now.
So that's an area where we've got to work towards through whatever means to try to get it a little competitive.
Yes. Either competitive or allow, and this is a longer conversation, I don't want to bore you, but even there's a thing called the minimum offer price rule that is enforced by PJM. If you want to build a new plant, you have to offer that into the auction. And they don't have a maximum offer price rule. They have a minimum offer price rule. And that minimum offer price rule has been interpreted that if we want to issue bonds for 30 years and we use our tax exempt rate on your behalf to do that, that's inappropriate to use that actual cost to bid it in. And the reason we had, this happened to our Delaware member, Delaware Electric Municipal Corporation. So some things are skewed to make prices higher because they want to incent generation, but it's not incenting generation. In my view, it is rewarding those people that currently have steel in the ground.
Right. Go ahead.
Slide 23, and I'll try to run through these. That's basically this capacity market. You have to have enough generation plus a reserve margin of 15% to show that you can point someplace to capacity so when it gets cold, you have enough and won't lean on somebody else.
That is the PJM rule?
Yes. MISO has really a similar rule, and it's about 15% as well. They run these auctions that are 3 years in advance, and the problem there is it's a 3-year in advance market that you're bidding in 30, 40, 50-year assets. So there's a mismatch between the timing there, at least in a lot of people's view. But the current auctions, whatever it takes, they project what the load's going to be, and then people bid into the market, and whatever it takes to clear the market, if it takes $55 to clear the market, then that's what everybody gets paid regardless of the cost.
So you know, Virginia, which has always kind of viewed itself as a southeastern state, with this PJM interconnect, is really tied into mid-Atlantic, almost northeastern type of cost structures.
From Chicago to Delaware, Virginia, and through Pennsylvania, Ohio, parts of Kentucky, that's PJM. So, but there are sub-markets which you probably don't want to get into, but for example, energy or capacity can be cheaper in this locational marginal pricing area or this locational delivery area. So there can be differences. There's a chart back here.
Yeah, but, you know, I mean, because one of the things we obviously do is we try to compete with southeastern states. So we're out of that, we don't have access to power in those regional transmission areas. And as a result, I mean, it's almost like we're getting pulled up almost inappropriately.
There are a number of people that think that those areas of the country, including the southeast, that don't have RTOs tend to have lower electric prices.
Right.
RTOs, there's an RTO to our south, is that correct? That would include Duke?
No, they don't have RTO.
Duke is in some RTOs, and other parts of them are not. The southeast really doesn't have an RTO.
Now, this may not be a helpful question for AMP, but it might be a helpful question for us. Does a municipality have an option whether to join the PJM or any other RTO or not join at all?
I believe the answer to that might be technically yes. You could try to set yourself up as a separate island portion of another RTO, but my understanding is what you would have to do that is basically impossible.
But the opting in or opting out, is that something that our state commission actually has some authority on?
Well, I'm not admitted in Virginia, but
understood.
Most of the things that are now under the FERC's jurisdiction, including transmission RTOs, are within interstate commerce as found by the FERC. So I won't say no, but
once you're in, it's hard to get out.
Yeah.
Okay. Somebody was asleep at the wheel.
Slide 24, that's the 3 years in advance, and in that you pay you pay for capacity 115% of your peak load, and you receive credit for what you own. The clearing prices for capacity can vary greatly. And Mr. Donahue gets to your question. If you look here, there's two things on here, and for PJM, there's really 3 or 4. There's a couple other areas in addition to this. But if the area is clear at a different price, then there can be different prices. So you'll see the green there. There was a huge spike in First Energy for the 2015-2016 thing. Actually, that's good for you folks because Fremont is getting paid the $8.94 in 15-16, which is less than you're being charged down here. So, but that, that's like congestion. Congestion can change because somebody builds a new generation plant or there's a new transmission, and all of a sudden those numbers change. Now here, the chart on 26 is showing a projection of your capacity with that load growth, and it shows what the stripes there at the top, shortfall, market purchases, however you want to do that, but that's things that you either are going to buy off the market one way or another short term, or you're filled with something longer, like an asset. So this is what your capacity is today and projected to be in the future. You'll see Prairie State on the bottom there. AFEC, the Fremont Energy Center, is the next block up. You got your SEPA, and I think Pinnacle is in that. No, Pinnacle is right above that.
John, can I make one comment?
Sure.
There are some blocks in 14, 15, and several years out that we have filled a lot of that void. So we don't have as much shortfall as depicted here in the upcoming years, but
Yeah, this is the capacity, that
We have
doesn't show
some- we have
your
some
AEP in the
blocks
short
we
term.
understand, like-
Yeah, this is just capacity, it doesn't show your AEP load shape that you have. Yeah, that's right. The next slide, again, this is showing capacity. This is where you'll get all your credits for 2015 in the capacity market. So you'll be getting about $8 million of credit and spending $11.5 million for total capacity. Currently, and I'll go through these again quickly, you've got a SEPA allocation of 5.6 megawatts, which wish you had more of, I'm sure. Has a very low load factor, but it gets you a capacity credit, and when you do get it, it's cheap. Fremont Energy Center provides both the intermediate and a peaking capacity to you, so you get about 49 megawatts of that in capacity credit, and then this is dispatched into the market whenever we make a buck by dispatching it into the market, we sell it, and you get the benefit of that. And when it shouldn't run because you can buy it cheaper, it doesn't run. Prairie State has your participation in there is about 50 megawatts, and you get a capacity credit for that Prairie State. That project, as we noted earlier, is in MISO. AMP has 368 megawatt share of that. We have 23.26%, which is the largest of the total of 9 owners of that plant. Most of those owners are also joint action agencies, public power. There are a couple co-ops that have a slice as well. The hydro that you're in, the AMP hydro sort of phase 1, we called it, is you're in there for 22.1 megawatts. That is 3 run-of-the-river hydro projects located on the Ohio River. These are existing locks and dams. They were already there. The Corps, when they built the dam, left a plug on one end. They had the locks on one side, a plug on the other, and the plug gets removed and you put a hydro facility in there. If it was that easy, it wouldn't cost $1.5 billion for the 3 of them. Those are coming online, and those times that are shown there. Smithland is running, it was started later, and it was the most challenged of those 3 projects. Cannleton is getting ready to spend the first unit probably in December, maybe in January, and we're planning for power supply purposes that would start mid-April. Willow Island in June. So that will all be in your power supply in 15 and 16.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, sir.
When these AMP projects that Danville invests in are late coming in, is there anything AMP intends to do to help members out in those situations? We've incurred considerable expense as a result of AMP coming in late.
Well, let me say a couple things about that.
When I say we, I'm speaking of our customers.
Yeah, you're going to have, the good thing is, to the extent that these are coming in later than originally anticipated, and I don't have that timeline here now, but the market right now is low. It's pretty cheap. So that's the good thing. There are discussions with various contractors and vendors on these projects about the reasons for perhaps some delays in schedule that I really can't get into here, but I can tell you that there are liquidated damage provisions in our contracts with our primary contractors as well as our primary equipment suppliers. As with any large, complex construction project, you're going to have things that happen. I can tell you that these projects in terms of the construction budget are within their construction budget currently. And so we aren't going to have any additional financing, we don't believe at this time, for any of these projects. And I don't know if Pam Sullivan, who was supposed to be here giving this, would be here tonight. She could have told you. I can't tell you right now how late or early or anything else these projects are at this point.
Well, we made, City Council and the Utility Commission made one bad decision a few years ago based on your projections. And we learned our lesson, but we also would like to know what assurances we have from AMP that they have in place that these projects don't fall in similar situations as, I think it was Prairie State.
Well, yeah, I wouldn't compare these projects to Prairie State in terms of the delay in it coming on. And that was something that we couldn't control on Prairie State. We tried very hard to change some things about Prairie State, some of which I think resulted in some good things, and I'll get into Prairie State in a little bit. But if Prairie State was what you're talking about there, yeah, that one was delayed.
We made some assumptions based on your timeline.
Yeah, and I would say, and I don't think I have to tell you that our board, including Mr. King, over time, and others that have represented Danville, have made sure that when things like that happen, that there is appropriate discussion about those things. You guys own us, and when we don't perform, we know it affects you, and we get told about it. And I think these guys can verify that. So. Meldal, you also have a small piece of the Meldal project, and that's really sort of two projects. The city of Hamilton has the Greenup project. It also initially got the license for Meldal, and so when that goes into service, we're also going to buy a portion of their Greenup plant, which has been up and running since the mid-'80s. And the rates on that look quite good, actually. Slide 34, you guys know this, it's just and energy purchases. You can do 7/24, which is 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, or 5/16, which is the peak times during the weekdays, and those are sort of the standards for purchases in the markets today. Now, turning to energy for a minute, if you look at slide 35, this shows the volatility of the energy market. And you'll see that A, it tracks natural gas, and B, it's been up and down. Since about 2009, there's sort of been this weird disconnect between oil and natural gas and the price of electricity that had pretty much tracked each other for a lot of years, going back before 2000. But the decisions that you made, that we made on the AMP-GS project, as well as Prairie State and some of these hydros that are now starting to come on, were made back during this 2007, 2008 time period, in which we were looking at prices that were way up there. And then what happened? Well, two things happened. One is the recession. Secondly, shale gas. So that has driven the price of natural gas down, which has led to today's lower prices. Here's some of your purchases that Jason was talking about a moment ago that didn't appear on this chart, but you have a number of purchases out of the market that are filling your energy needs today. That one of which goes out to 20, the others stop in 16 and 17. 37 is just a pie chart showing what your projected energy resources are going to be in 2015. And when Jolene talked about diversity, you guys are diverse. You've got some coal, but a limited amount of coal, and what coal you do have is as efficient as any coal plant in the United States, and more efficient than almost all. You've got some purchases, so you're on the market, so today's low market prices help you. You've got some hydro coming on, which is going to be renewable. I can tell you our first hydro project was Omega JV5, the Belleville project. The members in that, the 42 communities that are in that project, right now we're looking at and that project went in service in '99. We're looking at the debt being completely paid on that project in 2026, and after that, it's going to be 2.5, 3 cents power for a long time.
So these, and the hydro projects we're in are really more of a long-term play?
Very much so. In fact, we had looked at one time for the Belleville project. We had a chance to refinance it at attractive rates, and we were looking at maybe taking it out a bit longer. And took what we thought was a good plan to the AMP board, and we're told we did this for our grandchildren. So it's part of a long-term play that, well, you guys get Pinnacle now for pretty cheap.
Yeah.
I understood hydro, we count on hydro for a lot of our base load,
Yes.
and I understood that hydro is not necessarily that dependent. Is that going to be a problem with the river flow? It's going to vary that much?
Well, the good thing about building at a core dam on the Ohio River is they've got a lot of years of flow data. And we have a couple charts that show when the water might be too high and when the water might be too low, because both can be bad in a run-of-the-river project. But it's two things about it. One is there's diversity up and down the Ohio River.
Right.
Smithland, for example, it gets its best water to make electricity in the summertime when you need it, as opposed to some of the other further upriver. But more importantly, you can project the day before, sometimes 2 or 3, but you can certainly project the day before what you're going to be able to get out of those hydro projects the next day. So it is easy to shape what you're buying off the market, and or if we're going to run Fremont or some backup units, et cetera. So it is a good baseload project as a result of those things.
Thank you.
Can I ask you a question about the AEP shaped energy?
Yes.
That's going to run out next year. Are these years calendar years or fiscal years? Do you know?
I think these are calendar years.
Okay, so it's going to run out, the AEP shaped energy part of the portfolio runs out in December of
16.
Yeah, I think it's
December of
16.
15.
I think that's a misprint. I think it's 16.
Okay. Well,
Slide 36, I have 16 here.
I'm sorry, it says 15. I just want to ask you, do you all render us an opinion about what you think we should replace these, that contract, for instance, with? Do you?
At least.
What's the process?
Okay, at least once every 2 years, AMP has what is now called Leidos, but a nationally recognized engineering firm, do a power supply plan for each of our members. Sometimes we do it more often than that when we have a project that's going to come out. So I think we sent.
We have.
Yeah, so you have our latest capacity plan, which has some recommendations in it that I'm sure you guys or your staff is looking at currently about what to do about your power supply going forward, and some of the options that we think may be available for you.
And this is a report that is circulated among all your members?
Yes, we do it for all 129 members at least once every 2 years.
Okay. And you call it a capacity plan? That's what you called it?
Maybe a power supply plan.
Power supply plan.
It's a power supply plan. So.
Thank you.
And it looks at your capacity need and your energy.
Okay.
We looked at your energy and capacity. Somebody asked, and there have been a lot of newspaper articles, and maybe some of you have gotten some emails on what's happening in Paducah. So we were asked to basically talk a little bit about what your power supply is as opposed to Paducah. If you look at Paducah's 2015 projected energy resource mix, and this is slide 39, you'll see it looks much different than yours.
All in on the roulette table.
They are, I think they had some growth, some real growth that they thought was going to happen, and it didn't. But for whatever reason, they're in Prairie State, as you can see, very, very heavily on an energy basis, and that's obviously hurting them right now. As we said, and I might add, Paducah got in Prairie State actually before AMP did, and they have their own, they're a member of AMP now, but they formed an organization with Princeton called Kentucky Municipal Power Agency, and they bought into Prairie State actually before AMP did on behalf of its members. So they're separate in that respect, even though they're in Prairie State, but they're not in our Prairie State bonds or our Prairie State.
You didn't recommend they invest that heavily?
We would not have recommended that, no. And they weren't a member of ours when they decided to do this. This is their capacity portfolio, which is again different. They did install some combustion turbines in their community, and so they have a lot of capacity right now between Prairie State and combustion turbines. As you can see up at the top of this, they have 242 megawatts of capacity resources, and they've got about 160 megawatt capacity requirement. So they have a lot of capacity too. And in their situation, they're not in an RTO, so they don't have a ready market to sell that capacity.
It's probably not very high. Is it, what type of, is it turbines?
Yeah, there are two combustion turbines, like 64 megawatts each, so it's like 125 megawatts net for the two.
Well, you know, Virginia's got an abundance of gas pipelines that are now being built or being planned to be built. And we've got operators looking to sell blocks of gas. So it appears like it might be a buyer's market potentially in a couple of years here. Could you talk about that a little bit? I mean, we saw Dominion move from nuclear to gas. Huge position change in some of their base load capacity. We've got a pipeline running right by here to feed that puppy. It makes us think a little bit about what we ought to be doing here to diversify here in Danville.
Well, we're looking at something with you folks. In fact, we're going to make a site visit tomorrow on at least a...
Could you speak up, please?
Oh, I'm sorry. We're looking at a site here in Danville for some gas reciprocating engines to site here gas. There are what I would call great pricing places, a number of places right now that are selling gas at a discount off Henry Hub. And there's gas is going different ways in different directions, and yeah, we're looking at some of that. A little bit on the polar vortex. If you look at slide 42, on January 7th, there was a huge, it was cold, it was snowy, and there was a 22% forced outage rate in PJM. And you'll recall that people are required to have 100% of their capacity plus 15% reserves. It was very close to rolling blackouts in PJM as a result of it. Some of it was gas units didn't have firm gas transportation, or there was heating load that needed to be served. There was frozen coal or lack of coal deliveries in some places. And coal plays havoc on electric generation equipment from time to time. So there was close to at least rolling blackouts in PJM. So at the same time, there was gas prices that were approaching the equivalent of $100 a million BTU. Incredible. And today it's $4 and some change right now. So there's scarcity pricing out there, obviously. And that translates into $1,000 a megawatt hour for power. PJM saw, and this is, you know, I'm critical of PJM all the time, but they do take their job seriously of trying to keep the lights on. I'll give them that for sure. So they saw a second wave coming, saw what had happened a couple days before on January 7th, and said, okay, we have to get ready so that this doesn't happen to us, what almost happened to us last time. So they committed a lot of extra generation, and they basically said, we want you to run. We're telling you to run. And if that means you're buying high priced gas, that's going to happen, and that's going to get passed on to everybody. So 45 sort of gives a chronology of that. We had the first polar wave, which we talked about. PJM started scheduling the natural gas plants in advance so they could purchase their gas, et cetera. The gas for Tuesday must be purchased Friday because there was a Martin Luther King holiday there in which there wasn't gas trading. They were conservative on their forecast. Some people say overly conservative on their forecast. So they committed a large number of natural gas plants for the January 17th that ended up not being needed. The generators got paid the cost for being available, even though they were not needed, and all those are called uplift charges that get paid through ancillary service rates, congestion charges. So that was $19 per megawatt hour in January. That's an amazing figure. But that's how it happened. And what, you know, we were scratching our heads with saying, what do you mean you were depending on someone who didn't have firm gas transportation, but we've been paying them capacity, paying for their capacity, and when they was really needed, they weren't going to be able to produce.
They couldn't turn it on anyway.
And the penalty at the time was not very much. So I talked about this performance capacity that they're looking at now that may really jack up charges, and they're looking at correcting that, but it is awfully quick. It's not well thought out, and there are a lot of problems that everybody is talking about. So that's currently being debated inside PJM with a lot of comments right now, and we're going to see soon what they're going to end up doing. They even, at one point, suggested that they should go back and, in effect, reopen some of the other capacity auctions that already happened. So that's it on that. And I'm available to give you an update on AMP-GS if you want, or if you have further questions. I'd be happy to answer them. And I apologize for droning on for so long.
It's very helpful.
So the AMP-GS, excuse me, go ahead, John.
Of the 129 members, I'm assuming they all pay different rates, or is it calculated basically the same?
Each member in each project, with the exception of some congestion charges, would pay the same rate for that project. Some members are not in all the projects. Some members are completely on the market. For each particular project, or if we buy a block of power from JP Morgan Chase or NextEra or AEP or someone else, all of our members who get in and purchase that block of power pay the same rate, again, except for some transmission or congestion kind of charges, but they pay the same rate. So everybody has different power supply portfolios, so they end up having a different all-in rate from us.
Of the 5 members in Virginia, our rates to our customers is the highest. All right. Of those 5, are we the highest purchaser from you?
In terms of the amount of power, certainly. Danville is...
No, per 1,000 kilowatts.
You would pay for everyone that's in Prairie State. I think you're all in the same zone and pay the same congestion, so it's probably going to be the same delivered to each of them, with possibly the exception of some voltage differentials in your AEP rate, where they have a delivery at a lower... You guys are at 138? Okay, yeah, you're 138, so they may pay an extra delivery charge for being at a lower voltage. I don't know. But their Prairie State power would be priced from AMP the same
for all 5.
Yeah, and for each of these. Now, they could be bigger in Fremont or bigger in Prairie State relatively than you are, but that would be the only real reason that they have different amounts.
I guess my next question would be to Jason then. If we're the 5 members in Virginia basically paying the same, they're all Prairie State, why is ours $30 per 1,000 kilowatt hour per hour higher than the lowest?
We'll have to peel back that onion and see what the differences are between us and them. Like I said, some of these towns don't have the general fund contribution and allocations that we do. Their purchase power may vary, like you said. They may be into one project greater than we are into another. So we really need to see how the cards fall. And we can do that.
You mentioned voltage a little while ago, voltage, and did you mention that Danville had a lower voltage lines, and that would...
Your delivery is at the highest delivery voltage there is, 138.
Which is more efficient.
Right. Some are delivered at 69.
And there can be a different rate. Usually the lower voltages may pay an extra. Lower than 69 would usually pay something extra for that delivery. But we have 129 members, and I can tell you they have 129 different wholesale power rates, according to what they buy.
Bales, were you going to mention the litigation status?
Yeah, I can.
Please do.
As you know, we were on the short side of, we lost a motion for summary judgment partially to Bechtel, which we thought was wrong, but we on AMP's dime have continued to look at that. We filed with the Federal District Court in Columbus a motion, an alternative motion to either ask the court to certify the primary question in the case that we thought the judge ruled on inappropriately to the Ohio Supreme Court, for the Ohio Supreme Court to decide, because it's a matter of Ohio law. And then alternatively, if he didn't let us do that, let us appeal his ruling to the Sixth Circuit, the Federal Sixth Circuit, which is the Court of Appeals for the Columbus Federal District Court, because we think he was wrong in deciding that summary judgment motion. This month, excuse me, late last month now, or early this month it may have been. I apologize, I don't have the date in front of me. Judge Watson in the Federal District Court agreed that he should certify the question to the Ohio Supreme Court. And so that case is now being argued on whether they should take it or not. The Ohio Supreme Court doesn't have to take this motion to certify. On a percentage basis, they take 75–80% of such motions to certify from federal courts. And the issue there was this. Judge Watson said, Ohio law says if someone is wanton in their conduct, they can't take advantage of a limitation of liability clause in a contract, which is what Bechtel was using as a shield for what they'd done. In our view, he found they breached the contract. He found they didn't trend, they didn't give us the information on all those other projects that they were working on and about how those projects were getting cost overruns, a large number of projects. But he found also that they weren't wanton because they did trend a couple things. And since the standard for wanton is you have to show no care whatsoever, they met that standard. We argued, first of all, he was wrong. We had an expert witness, well-regarded construction person that said absolutely their conduct was wanton. They showed no care whatsoever for the price increase. He ignored that, which is an appealable issue to the Sixth Circuit. But more importantly, the Ohio Supreme Court had found that wanton was no care whatsoever, but that reckless was a little lower standard. It means that you knowingly go ahead with the risk of great harm to the person on the other side. And we thought we had that one in spades, we thought. 5 federal district courts found separately that wanton and reckless, for purposes of stiff-arming a limitation of liability clause, were the same. So you could show wanton, you could show reckless, you could show both, but if you showed either one, a defendant couldn't use that limitation of liability clause to escape liability when they were reckless in their conduct. So that case had a different standard in the Supreme Court, but it didn't go on to say, in the Ohio Supreme Court, but it didn't go on to say that, and the same thing applies to these limitation of liability clauses, because it was on another issue. So as I said, 5 federal courts had found that reckless did do that, and reckless and wanton were the same in terms of its ability to not do that. So we've now filed simultaneous briefs. I sent Jason a copy of that, as well as your city attorney, of what we filed and what Bechtel filed. We expect the Ohio Supreme Court is either going to take this or not in the next 30 to 45 days, maybe 60 because of the holidays. But we expect a decision out of that. If we win, then we go ahead and brief it to the Ohio Supreme Court. There's an oral argument, and then they render a decision about whether or not reckless allows you to trump a limitation of liability clause. If they decline to take it, then it goes back to Judge Watson, and he's going to decide whether or not he's going to let us appeal this. And the issue there is kind of funny, because he didn't dismiss our case completely. He said we could still prove we were damaged, but the limitation of liability was going to be $500,000. So we were looking at having a trial for $500,000 and then appealing his decision on the reckless standard and on whether or not the wanton standard, we met the wanton standard. So that's why this is good. That gets the larger issue done quickly. So that's where we are. Again, we're not adding to your stranded costs by doing this. AMP is doing that sort of on its dime. Now, if we win, we're going to take this part of the legal fees back, but but right now that's not adding to any of your costs.
If you deal with him, what's the limitation? Or what are you suing for?
Well, we've asked for $97 million. Million, yes. And we have those actual damages. I mean, when we asked them to tell us, you know, have there been changes in the price, because we're going to go ask our participants. I think, Joe, you were vice chair of the participants committee at the time, and we're at that meeting. We have to exercise the options for the property. And Bechtel, who was our agent for negotiating for the boilers and turbine generators, was telling us to sign this contract with Hitachi that was about a $500 million contract. And it had every month greater amounts of termination charges if we terminated. So they actually came back at a lower number by $20 million. And so we started buying the land, exercising the options. We signed the agreements. They didn't tell us anything in June, July, August, September, October. And at the end of October, after our conference, their CEO called Mark Gerken and said, we've been looking at the numbers, and it looks like instead of $2.2 billion, it's going to be 3.3. And we made a very tough but a good decision after that to cancel the project because there was no guarantee it wasn't going to go up another $1 billion. And frankly, we didn't have a whole lot of trust in what they were telling us. And we asked them if they would make a firm price of $3.1 million. No, they won't do that. So, long story, we've worked long and hard about that, and we're continuing. So you'll know the day after we do what the Ohio Supreme Court says.
Two quick questions. One, when do you think the Ohio Supreme Court will render a decision if they accept the case?
If they accept the case, it'll have to be briefed.
So it'll be next summer?
I would say spring or summer, yes.
Now, this the second part of the question. If the Ohio Supreme Court chooses not to hear the case, will the district federal gov judge allow you to go to the Circuit Court of Appeal?
Well, he said he would decide that if it got remanded.
He gets to make that decision.
He gets to make that decision. I think he doesn't want to tie up his courtroom for 3 weeks on a trial that's going to have to be redone if we win the appeal. So I think judicial economy would say that he lets us appeal.
I understand. Now, do you know what our exposure is on this? Are we finished with our stranded costs?
Right now, what we have given you is as much as you're going to be charged, with one exception, okay? That is this. We are carrying on AMP's books a plan held for future use that represents the land, the permits, which we're keeping up for transmission and generation power siting, we, to the extent that we can sell it for as much as on the books or more, and we're on the tail end of the shale play down there, which is we're going to take a look at whether or not there might be some shale gas under there. Any difference in what's on the books, and that would be charged back to the members. So that's the only thing there is outstanding. Other than that, you're, with the exception of interest on what we have already said, there's no issue.
Thank you.
But if you do win, there'll be a proportional award back to
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Or if we settle, I suspect that there will be, if we win in the Supreme Court or in the Sixth Circuit on appeal, I suspect there will be some settlement discussions. I can't tell you that for sure, but I suspect there will be. If we don't, then obviously there's not going to be any settlement discussions. They will move on.
All right. Anybody else?
My I could just add one little piece to the story. I think all the participants of the NPS were looking very closely, constantly at the prices. But there was also a timing issue because of the uncertainty of the regulations, Ohio and federal. We were trying, to the extent possible, to get beyond the starting line so that this would be considered a plant that was under construction and fall into a different regulatory situation than one that had not started construction. So we had two things we were trying to keep our eye on. One was the prices, and they were inching up, but still within the acceptable range. But we were feeling a real sense of urgency to get us, get beyond the starting date so that we could be defined as a plant already under construction. This is at a time that I'm a cynical nonpartisan, so I'm not saying one party or the other, but this is at a time when a new president had come in and environmental regulations were very high on the list, that he was going to do away with coal.
There was a sequestration issue, if I recall.
That was later.
This plant would have to, put in a sequestration plan. It really was getting out of hand.
So whether mistakes were made or not, every single person involved was representing a local utility and local consumers trying to get a source of power that would be reliable at the lowest possible cost. And there are all these pressures going on. And it was a shock after having been, these prices were refreshed frequently. It almost seemed like we were just driving our consultants crazy, constantly looking at these prices to make sure that the costs were still within an appropriate range. We went to the annual meeting in October of that year and got a declaration that it still makes sense, this is still a good investment, and that was all on the basis of the general contractor assuring us of these prices. And no sooner had we gotten back to our communities than the bottom fell out. And at that point, it would have been foolish to continue the construction of the plant when we could predict the power costs would be way beyond what the projected market was. So I think one thing these stranded costs are very painful, but it was the best of some really bad choices, and we're all very unhappy with that. I think the right decisions were made under the circumstances.
Thank you, John.
Thank you all.
Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Look forward to seeing you all Wednesday.
Appreciate it.
Thank you. Would anyone from the public care to make a comment at this time?
What's your thoughts on the possibility that we might have more congestion charges this year, this winter, or following winter?
Chairman, go ahead.
Yes, please.
I wish I could tell you. Van Sullivan, who's one of our peers, and is in charge of this, I think they do some projections for what congestion might be, but it is very difficult, but we can attempt to provide you guys, if we do have such projections, we can attempt to provide them. But if a transmission line goes out because of a lightning strike or a tree falling on it, that can change those charges. It's a dynamic system that stretches all over the place. So but if we have it, we'll give it to you.
But did you not say PG&M has arranged to have more generation somehow lined up, or is nothing?
Well, So you've got EPA regulations for mercury and air toxics will be affecting coal plants in 2015. So you will see in the spring a number of plant closures related to that have nothing to do with the CO2 regulations. And the time it takes to replace those with new gas, there's just not enough time. So that's why you see people investing in new transmission, which drives the transmission costs. But in all their projections, they haven't said that we're going to have a crisis yet, but it's getting really tight. The market's getting really, really tight.
One other question here. You know, when we did have the congestion problem, what about these demand response participants? Were they required to participate there? And who governs them? Is it the RTO or is it the generators? And if they didn't participate when they were supposed to participate, were they fined? And did we see any benefit from it?
There's a lot of questions there, and there are some changes that are proposed by PJM. Most of the demand, a lot of the demand response was summer only. So there were a number of folks who participated in demand response that didn't have any obligation to curtail during the winter. See, this was a winter peak, and
Highly unusual.
the demand response program was built up, frankly, around summer peaks for the most part. So there was a kind of demand response that only had an obligation to decrease. There was some demand response that was voluntary. I think there was some demand response that was year-round demand response, but I'm not the person that has that.
As I thought they got paid all year round if you were a participant.
You might get paid all year round, but for those people that were summer, Jason maybe
The demand response is for the summer months only. I think PJM is going to have different programs this coming year, maybe a summer program and then an all-year program. That's going to be new. So there were no programs for this past January, so there was no obligation to curtail your load.
Thank you. Mr. Vesey?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I know the hour is late. Had I known it, I would have brought dinner for everybody, maybe next week. Mr. Chairman, I always like to be able to contribute something new that we haven't talked about or reiterate something that we have talked about. And I know, again, you have a tough mission ahead of you. You have a number of middlemen between you and the producer and the consumer, clearly. You have even more regulators between you and your consumers, clearly. In addition to the 111D rule, I do want to make you aware there's, in addition to the air toxics and the mercury rule, which is going to reduce the fleet of generation, you also have another rule going on at the same time called the NAAQS ground level ozone standard, and that's taking the ozone standard from a 75 parts per billion to a 60 parts per billion. Why do you care? You care because NERA is a national research organization, has estimated that it could increase the cost of electricity 15%. This is going on as a compounding effect of all the other things you've heard. I point this out because it's just one more item in the further complexity to be in the electric utility business. It's not getting less complex, it's getting more complex. So we do realize the difficult situation that you're in. That being said, we want to reiterate 3 of our 4 points that we started in August, just for your consideration, because we know you're coming up on the time period where you're going to be looking at your rate consultant's report. You'll be deliberating on what you want to do going forward. The very first item we mentioned was the issue of whether you call it a rate or we call it a tax. It is the tax that you're charging on top of your cost of service and your reserve fund. It has a substantial impact on the rates. You've heard this before. We encourage you to take a look at that. And in sincerity, we do realize what the implication is, as Mr. King has pointed out, on the rates, potentially for real estate. But of course, we haven't talked yet about how you could cost control your way there or grow your way there. Those are 2 other options to meet that. We encourage you to take a look at some of those options. We mentioned as a part of that at the last meeting that you do have problem that we thought you should take a look at. And Mr. Chairman, with your permission, I'd like to hand out a brief that we've had written by the former Deputy Attorney General, Wes Russell. He is an attorney with Bland and Sorkin, and he has taken a look at this issue of whether or not the taxes that are being charged by the utility to the consumer that are then being sent as a transfer fund to the general fund are appropriate. We've got a brief that addresses that, but in particular, you are unique in that you provide services and you provide taxes to citizens that don't reside in your community, that being Halifax and Pennsylvania. And there absolutely is no question, according to him, and let me read this, as a general rule, the locality may not constitutionally impose taxes on citizens outside their boundaries. And he goes on to cite a circuit court case where he says, ultimately the court found that charging excess rates to customers were outside the city limits constituted unconstitutional extraterritorial taxation. And he goes on to opine that raising significant questions as to whether Danville's practice can withstand a legal challenge. Those are real issues. We said last week that we thought we had found this and we would come back with a citation. So, Mr. Chairman, with your approval, I have copies for you all to take a look at.
Can I just ask a clarification? Does this relate to differential rates?
It relates to the fact that our utility serves
TV.
outside.
So let me just read, that's the reason we had the brief written.
Because
As
it
I
serves
understand it
outside
from
the
Mr. Russell,
municipality.
it is explicitly tied to,
We are,
for lack of
in
a better
fact,
description, the $9 million that you transfer to the general fund. What proportion of non-voting taxpayers pay that? Meaning, what proportional share you assign to Halifax and Pennsylvania customers, that could be considered, in his opinion, we share this, as unconstitutional.
Do you have another copy?
I'm sorry, I didn't bring enough
Copy
copies.
over there?
Here, take mine.
That's all right.
Mr. Chairman,
As long as our attorney has it, that's fine with me.
we thought we would bring something that had all the citations and the legal precedent, not from our opinion, but from his. You can do with what you want, but we thought that would be a good contribution. Mr. Chairman, the last issue is just context. We do realize that you're looking at rates mostly on the consumer side, on the residential side. And we just want to reiterate that after everything is settled, you may still have a rate structure that is no longer competitive. And that is unfortunately a situation we live with. If you're captive and you live in the community, you don't have that challenge. But companies that are in this jurisdiction and in the surrounding jurisdiction who do have choices, there will be economic consequences if the rates stay the way they are. They are not sustainable at the current rate. And people have asked us, well, what is the right rate? Well, we don't really know the right rate for this utility. We'll find out from the consultant, but they need to be at least benchmarked against AEP. That is going to be what most industrials look at who are here. And then from an economic development point of view, I'm working a project right now with one of our members looking at locating a facility, a satellite facility in Southern Virginia. They will not consider this community until this rate issue is addressed. They will probably locate in an area where they have a co-op. Still not the cheapest, but it's predictable. That's what businesses need, is predictability. So I hope that's helpful. We try to bring something new every meeting. We're available to answer questions anytime. And again, I want to encourage and commend you for your transparency and keeping this moving forward.
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
I would, Mayor, please, appreciate all your extra work and your comments. The issue with your court challenge, your court case that you were telling us, we're going to be looking at the rate of return of the stakeholders of this utility. And I'm sure you've taken a lot of time and effort to point out to us on several occasions about this court case. I'm sure we will consider that. I'm sure we don't have to be reminded of it every week. And I certainly appreciate your input, but the threats or whatnot, we're going to consider all this. And we don't need to keep stirring up little fires around the edges. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fesky.
I think
I do see this as referring to differential rates. So we'll be happy to review this. It would be helpful if the information you share is accurate. We've had that problem in the past.
Yeah, I think that I corrected that situation, but I assume a deputy attorney general probably.
And, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to add, we're not at all not concerned about industrial rates. As a matter of fact, that's driving my interest in this.
No, I appreciate that, sir.
Well,
Absolutely.
I think you should realize that and let us have credit for that.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bessie. Anyone else?
I think it is important, though, that the fact is, if you look at the case that's cited here, it is about differential rates where the city was charging twice the rate that it was charging its city residents. And in fact, that's not the case here. We have a standard rate that is applied to a classification regardless of geography. Is that correct?
Anyone else have anything from the public? Any of the members of the committee have anything they'd like to say today? It's been a nice, long day.
Thanks for coming.
Very informative. And we will end now. Thank you all, Mr. Benton and Mr. Thompson, for being with us all the way from Ohio on a snowy day. We appreciate you being here.